this is the chemistry between TTRPGs and EDU. This is actually about chemistry. So it's not, it's like there's a little bit of a play on words, but it is actually like a chemistry lesson as well. So just as a heads up. Uh, I'm Steph. So I run the TTRPGkids website. It won an ENnie a couple of years ago for best online content. If you're looking for information about educational tabletop RPGs, I have a whole section on the website about that. So it's all ages TTRPGs in general, but there's a very strong EDU section. I am a former airbag engineer, so it's not showing up super great there, but I have a couple patents on knee airbags. So if you've ever been in a car accident and your knee airbags saved your knees, it might have one of those in there. So, and then I am a former engineering professor. I use a lot of tabletop RPG elements in the classes that I taught. And so there's like, we're going to be kind of in this middle section here. Is the overlap. Most of the people that are part of the conference either have degrees specifically in education or in a therapeutically aligned field. I am the mad scientist of the group, rolling in with a degree in engineering, but I also like teaching people. So it's kind of a, I made all my stuff about science and problem solving for this. So that's what you're going to get here is the mad science one. Is there anybody here who does not know what a TTRPG is? Okay. Okay.
Well, I'd be curious, like, what is it not? Like, are there
Okay.
categories of games that wouldn't, like, that you would consider TTRPG?
Yes. So, certain games that have like where it is just straight mechanics, I would not consider like a tabletop RPG. Like I love Boop, for example. So, but it's not really a tabletop RPG because you're not necessarily taking on the role and acting it out. A tabletop RPG is going to be something that's like a at least somewhat immersive in terms of you playing a character that is in the game. Um, so I have it on here where there's some collaborative storytelling element. It doesn't need to be a lot, but it can be somebody providing the fiction and you're a character in it and you make some kind of choice. Um, it is fictional. Um, there is some element of chance, and generally it's going to be cooperative. So when we're doing it for the classroom, I always make it cooperative because otherwise, I mean, you know, Monopoly in the classroom would be my brother, the accountant, has, let's say, made it so we do not play Monopoly as a family anymore. So he made a spreadsheet, and it's pretty ridiculous. He wins every time. So what we're going to be doing here is, and I misspelled class, we're going to be combining chemistry class and TTRPGs. We're going to have the game meet the class, not the class meeting the game. We're going to be using a PH Lab example, and then we're going to have a Q&A at the end. So when I say that the game will meet the needs of the class, this means that we have a cat in a box here. The cat is the game, and it fits in the box. Or sorry, if it fits, it sits. So the class is the game, or the class is the cat, and the fun game facilitates the cat, what the cat wants. So if the game is not made for the class, the cat may still be having fun, but it doesn't really fit in the box very well, and the cat's probably going to just be kind of messing with the box. We're going to be looking at the game's mechanics, the lore, and how the players interact and what they're getting involved with. So that way, they're not just like getting distracted playing with the game elements. They're still like in the class and learning, but they're not like, you know, getting tangled up in everything else. So in order to do that, we're going to set some educational goals first. When you're making an educational tabletop RPG, you want to pick 1 to 2 core goals. That's about what you would do for like a core class session is you're going to have a couple goals that you want to focus on. You may have some additional like side goals that you're looking at, but generally it's going to be like, I am going to teach a pH lab. You want to include these as much as possible in your game, so it's not just going to be like a side quest to go look for pH strips, so that way you can do one experiment. You want to have everything in your game about like this pH lab. And typically I aim for 3 points of contact. So I want this theme or these goals to show up at least 3 times in my game. I usually do like a 3-step approach, and that fits the storytelling process fairly well. Is you're going to have some kind of introduction, some kind of middle, and some kind of conclusion. And so you have a different way of introducing the concept within each of those sets of the story. And you can incorporate it potentially into each one of these. So you can have your mechanics be about the topic, you can have your lore be about the topic, and you can have the way your players play the actual game and talk about it be part of that topic. So when we look at integrating it into mechanics, there's a few ways you can do this. One is with modifiers, increasing your roll or like whatever it is that you're doing in the game based on the amount of work. So it's, if they do some work, they get a bonus, and it can be kind of that encouragement to earn those extra points. You could have puzzle-based success. So you can have a puzzle in the game that uses the topic that you're teaching, and you have to solve the puzzle in order to progress the story forward. And you also want to make sure that you have undistracting dice rolls. So there are some games where it gets very, very crunchy, and if it's very, very crunchy, you are learning game mechanics that have nothing to do with your educational goals instead of focusing on learning your educational goals. It's kind of like you have 10 points of brain power to put towards a class, and if you're spending 4 points learning game mechanics that have nothing to do with your subject, you only have 6 points now to put towards learning your material. So you want to make sure that whatever you do with your mechanics, it is fairly undistracting. It's not going to overcomplicate things to the point where that becomes the focus instead of like your educational material. When you're looking at integrating it into the lore, you want your setting to support the material and have it be something that's kind of like engaging, something that's going to draw them in. So you'll see when we do the pH example, it is set in a medieval fantasy kind of scenario, but everything about it, like there's an alchemist, there is a swamp witch, they are all using some kind of chemistry element to them. So it ties into the story, but it also ties into the subject and creates a logical reason for us to be doing a pH lab within the lore of the game and story. And that's kind of the cool characters in a profession. So you can have your NPCs be in a profession that's using the material that you're teaching. You could also have your players being in that profession. So like I make sciencey nerdy games. This one right here is to teach about what park rangers do in their day-to-day life. So all of the players are playing park rangers that have like little mech units that they can control and send out to go do jobs and things like that. But they're playing as the park ranger. And part of that job is actually like doing paperwork. So there's your written assignment, but it's part of like who their character is. So it's a really good way to like integrate that. We're not going to have that so much in the example here, but it is one other method that you can do. Yeah.
Do you anti-elements, for example, characters that would be NPCs that are against what your characters are trying to?
You potentially could. A lot of the stuff that I do is going to be environmental based, like antagonism. So there's not like a bad guy necessarily, but you totally could do that. I think like in Ranger Mech Squad, one of the like scenarios that you can have is people have vandalized part of the park. Or maybe you need to submit a proposal for funding for something, and that could be getting funding to clean up the vandalism in the park. And then you're going to have an NPC that's like, I don't know about that. And like, you got to have some kind of argument for it. But then you're arguing from the point of view of your character. So that can also be like a good way of, if you have to construct an argument from a certain perspective, you have to actually think about the material in order to talk about it. So definitely using like an opposing character can be a fun one. Does that answer your question?
Yes.
Okay, sweet. And another element to this is to showcase the world's need for this skill. So in our pH lab, you've got people making potions, or you've got a mad scientist who has decided to do some weird stuff and has spelled his own doom. And you've got to kind of go in and fix it. In something like the ranger one, it really clearly shows like why park rangers are needed. And that's part of the lore and the story of it. You don't expressly need to state park rangers are needed for this because they have played that out and acted it out. So it's this intuitive learning, and that tends to be a lot more meaningful than like telling people you need this. So having that integrated into the lore is a way of teaching that without telling somebody. And then looking at how it's integrated into the characters. So you can have characters directly related to the topic. So the park ranger one's another like good example for that. You could have players being scientists. I was talking earlier about the stoichiometry lab one. So this is another chemistry one that I've come up with. Whereas a stoichiometry lab, you're playing as medieval medics who need to balance chemical equations properly in order to make medicine for baby owlbears. And so if you do not do it correctly, you cannot cure all the baby owlbears. You'll run out of ingredients, or you'll make the potion wrong. Those characters were directly related to why you might need stoichiometry in order to make something properly. You can have the topic give them some kind of special power. Let's see, trying to think of the other chemistry one. There was one, it was a slime lab for grade school kids. And so there's ways to build in, adding different colors and things like that, seeing a small chemical reaction, how that works. They got special powers depending on what their slime ended up being like at the end. And so that's really cool because now, okay, if you have like a glittery green slime, what does that do? You get to do some cool stuff. And so like kids get excited about that. You can do that with these here. Maybe they have special powers, like if the pH of the chemical they're using is within a certain range, you have acid powers. And in other ones, you can like neutralize things. You get like base powers. So you can have it like directly integrated into the character as well. And then this gives them a personal bond with the material. If you are like the slime lab, the kids like tend to usually bond with the slime a little bit, where they're like, oh, this is my slime, it's so cool. And like now they will talk about, oh yeah, when I added this, this happened, or yeah, when we mixed it together, like I made the slime. They're gonna remember that for forever. Like instead of it just being like, okay, we mixed some stuff in class, it was kind of fun. Now there's like a story attached to it, so it sits in your brain a little bit longer. And so now we're going to look at what this might look like using this pH lab example. So our educational goals are going to be to understand what pH is and to observe acid-base reactions. We want to also make sure that we're doing a few experiments. We're going to use pH testing strips on known solutions. We're going to measure pH of an unknown solution or unknown solutions to identify them. And then we want to neutralize an acid with a base. So this is something that would show up in a regular chemistry lab and could be like a decent lesson plan for like middle school. For our mechanics, we're going to focus on doing puzzle-based successes and having undistracted dice rolls. For our story connection, we're going to make sure that the story is supporting the material. We're going to showcase some characters who are directly related to the profession in some way. And we're also going to emphasize why the world might need some of these skills. And then for our character connection, we're going to have our characters directly relate to the topic. So they're going to be involved in the story and actively helping with things. And it's also going to help them form a personal bond with the material by interacting with it and making their own story about the material. So, part one. So I said there's always that like beginning, middle, end. So our beginning is our character intro and training. We have these adventurers. They have gotten a quest to go get treasure from this alchemist's labyrinth that is hidden. It's trapped up, especially if you say booby trapped in front of a bunch of middle schoolers. Like, it's gonna be like, ah. You gotta make it kind of funny. But he's booby trapped it with alchemy because the dude, like, he's basically a chemist, you know. He's kind of paranoid, and nobody has seen him for like a couple years. They don't know what's happened to him, but we know that there's treasure down there. So before you go in there, you're told that you need to go to the Swamp Witch to get special knowledge in order to get down into the lab, and she is the only one that can teach you this magical power. This is going to be how we learn to use pH testing strips. So you're going to give the students a whole bunch of solutions in cups, and this is just a regular pH lab, and testing strips. And they're told to find the pH of each of the solutions and write it down because they will need to know this later in order to get into the lab. They're all going to be labeled jars, and they make a nice list of what is the pH of water, vinegar, milk, etc. Like pretty standard substances. And you emphasize how important it is that you must have this later. If you don't have it, it will be a disaster. So they have to write it down. And like, I've done this with my kid, and as soon as I'm like, oh, you need this later. Okay. Like, you know, got my like 6-year-old writing down, like trying to spell out milk and things like that. Like, how do you spell vinegar? And like, you know, it gets like very engaging, and you like write the numbers down next to it. So this is our first point of contact. Next, after you have gone through your training with the Swamp Witch, and the starter lab like doesn't take usually very long, 10 minutes or so max. Okay, so you have gone through your training with the Swamp Witch, and it is time to delve into the labyrinth. You see this dark archway that leads down into this tunnel. You start meandering through it, and turn after turn, you have dodged every blast of acid, every like pit of spikes. You have crossed pools of like bubbling liquid that you have had to like dodge over or like neutralize in some kind of way. And you get to what looks like the final door. And on this door, there are 4 vials and a magical keypad. If you answer incorrectly, a booby trap will go off. And who knows what will happen? Probably an explosion. So, in order to figure out the code, you need to measure the pH of the unknown solutions and identify them using what you have gleaned from the Swamp Witch's training. And then put the name of the vial contents into the keypad. So you're going to use your testing strips, measure the pH, match the chart from part 1, enter the names. At this point, you're usually going to get a student who is like, well, I want to see what happens when we do the booby trap. And you can explain how absolutely epic this explosion is going to be, or let the kid explain it and blast them away. But it does not break the door down. The door is still there, and the vials on the door have been magically protected to not shatter in the event of an explosion. So you have been blasted back, and you know, like this kid, you know, goes in and just types in like chocolate or like who knows what else. But that's always going to happen at some point or other. My kid did it. Usually after like a couple tries, and it's just like, okay, explosion, explosion, it gets boring, and it's like, okay, let's see what's behind the door. And once they have put it in and the door has swung open, this can be a really good time to kind of pull students out of the fiction a little bit, because sometimes it can be hard getting too far into the fiction, especially if this is the first time students have played a role-playing game before, to say, okay, we're going to go back to the classroom now. And usually it's like a good, like, lets everybody settle after we had the fun explosion. And everyone's like kind of, you know, like wiggling around and chatting and things like that. How might this apply to the real world? So being able to identify unknown solutions. How could this apply to the real world? So it's a question for the audience. Why might you need to know this? Yes.
You're saying over to a friend's house and they have unmarked solutions in their refrigerator and you're thirsty.
Mm-hmm. You're like, is this orange juice or milk? Any other ones? Okay. Cleaning solutions. Yep, 100%. You also don't want to make an explosion on accident. So it's a safety thing too. If you're looking at different chemicals and you're not sure what they are, um, scientists, when they're like testing things out, mixing things together, they may need to know what the pH is so they don't mix the wrong things together and create some kind of reaction they're not expecting. So it's a safety thing. And that's a great segue into part 3, because now you are in the lab and it is full of this weird gas. It's toxic. It starts pouring out of this machine in the corner, or it's been pouring out of this machine in the corner, and it looks like this machine is some element that the alchemist had set up previously, and it's just like gone haywire and has been creating this deadly poisonous gas for like the 2-3 years that the scientist has gone missing. You need to neutralize it. So you see like some kind of reading on the wall, and it's showing like the pH going all over the place. And you know that if you can get it to neutral, that the gas will go away and dissipate. And this is the point where you start a timer because you don't want to be breathing in the gas for too long. So you give them a solution, like a vial, and you say, okay, here is an acid, or maybe you don't even tell them like what the pH is. You say, we need to get the pH to 0. And you give them maybe like 3 solutions that are safe to mix with each other. So don't, no cleaning products. But you give them 3 safe solutions and you say, here is your solution that you need to get to 0. Add the others until you get it to 0. And so they're going to have to test multiple times to see what the pH is, and they can see how it fluctuates up and down. So they're going to test the first one, test the second and third, see what the pHs of everything are, and be able to mix them back and forth. You want to emphasize, add small amounts so it stays safe and you don't overshoot too much. Test it frequently. And usually when I say there's like a vial with stinky but safe liquid, like it's going to be maybe like vinegar or something. So that way, as you're changing things, you can maybe see how something smells differently. If you're using like a baking soda solution, which is always fun. If it fizzes, like that's always fun to record. One of the ones that I like to do is you've got vinegar, lemon juice, and like a baking soda solution. They're all safe. They all have distinct smells or a neutral smell. So you can kind of mix them together and see what happens. And like, of course, my kid just went, oh, take the baking soda, take the lemon, ignore the vinegar, dump them together, and it fizzes all over the place because it's also like an acid-base reaction. And that can be a great teaching moment too. So like, kids will kind of mess with the experiment, but leave it where there's like open room to play with it. And then just, it's not a big deal to say, here's more of the 2 solutions. Let's figure out the problem now. And once they start seeing it kind of fizzing and reacting, that's usually kind of a fun re-engagement point. And that's where, as you're going through, note any reactions that take place, and you can talk about that. So once it's neutralized, and you're like, okay, let's get into the treasure. So you've neutralized all of the gas, it has dissipated, and you could see everything very clearly. There, in the corner of the lab, you see a skeleton dressed in alchemist robes. And it seems like this alchemist has probably did an incorrect experiment, didn't measure the pH beforehand, mixed 2 things that he probably shouldn't have, but clutched in his hands. And like kids, like especially, I mean like my 6-year-old loves it when there's like a skeleton that's all piratey or something like that. And like he's holding a chest in his hands. He's like, I'm gonna go take the chest. Does the arms stick to it? And like, sure, like the arms stick to the chest and you have to like brush them off. He's like, okay, cool. You open it up. And what would be a really cool treasure that you think you could put in this alchemist chest? Any ideas? Something besides just like gold. Candy. Okay. Huh? Yeah. Homework pass. That is another one. So that's a good mix of like ideas there because you could have
So they can do whatever they want with them at home.
you know, and the maybe in hindsight, the alchemist should have used the pH strips before doing the experiment. So, and that's where you can kind of combine it. You can ask the class just like that. Um, Combining all of those, I would probably say, okay, there's a little packet of pH strips. There's a bag of saltwater taffy, which, by the way, here you go, everybody in class. Everybody gets a candy, or it could be a chocolate coin or something like that if you wanted to do gold. Um, and then homework passes are great, or saying, okay, cool, everybody like participate in this. We got to the end of the class period. Everyone can have like +5 points on the next assignment, or we're considering like good grade for the lab. Um, and then what was it you had said? Ice cream. Yes. Liquid nitrogen ice cream. So there could be supplies for liquid nitrogen ice cream, or um, so I was in the Society of Physics students in college because of course I was. We had like a liquid nitrogen ice cream like bonus lab that we talked the professor into doing after class, where like you mix stuff together. That could be a really cool treat to do as part of a chemistry class on like a free period or something like that, or like just at the end of this, if you got 15 minutes extra, you bust that out and everyone's like, yeah, that could be pretty sweet. So maybe there's supplies to make liquid nitrogen ice cream. Um, and that could be a good discussion point too about how it reacts, like what the difference is and things like that. So whatever it is, make it something pretty cool so there's a good reward at the end. So if you do something like this again, students know that there's going to be like a good reason for doing the lab, because usually the first time it's kind of like, why are we doing this? And then the second time it's like, okay, cool, like we're going to get like something nice at the end. And there's tends to be a little bit more engagement. And then during the wrap up or the wind down, it's really good to connect it to points that maybe are like side notes on your educational goals. So lab safety is a good one to cover with this. And there's a lot of really clear examples about why certain elements of lab safety might be important. We can talk about the uses for measuring pH. So if we're looking at mixing different chemicals and things like that, how it can help us not just with safety, but with being able to see the results of our experiments, being able to see like how things have changed. So the acid-base mixing can be a good one for that. And then looking at different chemical reactions. So as you're going through like the acid-base mixture, what do those chemical reactions mean? Or looking at how you can identify solutions based on other elements like smell or viscosity or color and things like that, not just based on pH. So those are good discussion points that you can have towards the end. And of course, you can also have it where maybe it just ends with like, you say, okay, so as you're leaving with the treasure, you forgot one last booby trap. You trip over it on the way out, tell me what happens. And that can always be kind of like a fun pull them back in towards the end. So from this example, we completed all 3 labs, or all 3 sections of the chemistry lab. We met the class goals. We added story elements to a existing lab. Like if you look at it, it was just a standard chemistry lab that had about 5 to 10 minutes of story time in it. So it's not adding a ton extra to your class period time. So it can still fit in your class period, but it has that engagement element, and odds are kids are gonna do the experiments a little bit faster if they're engaged with it versus just kind of sitting like measuring, chatting with their friends, going back and doing the thing. Like I've seen like with my kid, when we've done science experiments and things like that at home, it's, if there's a story attached to it, it usually takes about 30 minutes to go from start to end. I've also tried out with not doing the story elements, and it's kind of like, Kiddo is 6, so I know it's different from middle school, but there's a lot of similarities at the same time. I think Kiddo got up like 4 times. We had to stop the experiment, come back to it like an hour later. Just the attention span wasn't there. So the story helps keep the attention span on the actual experiment. And then it also facilitates a lot of practical application discussions that you normally can't do when it is just class material, class material, class material. There's live examples that they have interacted with, participated in, and immersed themselves in. So they're going to take that away a lot more than if it's just like, make sure you practice lab safety because the owl says to put your glasses on in the book. So it's kind of, there is something very clear to connect with. And it's fun because who doesn't like it when there's explosions involved? And so at this point, so I usually tie most of my stuff to be like half of it is like lecture and then the other half is questions. And this can be about chemistry lab. It can be about like other science labs and things like that. I've also done some stuff with like social studies we were talking about and whatnot, but just different ways of applying it or different examples. It's just kind of time to chat if you'd like. So, yes.
So I'm a librarian. So
Yeah.
this applies differently to maybe somebody who's teaching in a
Mhm.
classroom. How would you adapt this scenario taught in like an after school program as
Mhm.
opposed to in a classroom situation?
Yep. So I have done a couple seminars on making a tabletop RPG for your particular library. And it is usually a bit easier to integrate it into a library scenario because you sometimes have more freedom to have like longer periods of time or to get it approved. Whereas like, let's say the principal walks in, well, you have like pictures of like a mad scientist up there mixing things together and like, what are you doing? So there's kind of, I've really liked working with librarians on a couple of these. Um, if you're looking at doing like an after school program, a lot of this can be like the same ported over. Like the chemistry lab, it's chemicals that you can typically find at home. They're not going to be terribly expensive, and it's fun to kind of mix them up and stuff like that. You could do it. We went to our like library start a summer event, and they were doing stuff with like liquid chalk. So they like crushed chalk up, and we're using it to paint on the sidewalk. I was thinking that that could also be like another one kind of along the lines of this, where you've got different colors of chalk, you're looking at mixing them together, and potentially come up with some kind of like story or educational lab using like it doesn't necessarily have to be like the official chemicals, but you can still teach lessons with that. Kind of like with the slime lab. Like that's another one where if you attach some kind of story to it, like it can be advertised as a slime lab, but then when they get there and you're like, okay, we got this story and like it's more about like your comfort with being able to storytell and improv in front of them along with the experiment. About like how you can integrate that into the program. Does that kind of answer your question or?
Yes.
Okay, cool. And if I'm ever not answering the question because like I have strayed or like gotten the wrong idea or something, please let me know. So, yeah. Um, so I have like really bad anxiety and specifically with public speaking, um, it like ticks off a little bit differently. Um, so it's actually more comfortable for me to be doing a role playing exercise or like storytelling exercise than it is to be necessarily like up teaching in front of the class. So for me, it's more my comfort zone than it is the other way around. So it's something that like kind of helps me to engage with the class as well, in addition to helping the class engage with the material. That said, there is still like a learning curve associated with it because like the first time doing it, I was like, uh, it was with my freshman college engineering class that I was teaching. It was a project-based class where they had like 10 experiments they needed to do over the course of the semester and needed to write like papers for them, or there was a group presentation. It was a lot of teaching engineering soft skills while giving them some hands-on projects to tide them over through freshman year when there's not a whole lot of hands-on experiments because they're taking like basic math classes. There might be like some chemistry labs involved in there, but it's a lot more lecture-based. when I first introduced it, I'm like, okay, so we have this class character that we're going to be journaling about between class sessions and about how this character has progressed their career based on what they learned in each class session. Half the class was like, oh, this is just like D&D club. And I was like, thank you, nerds. And then the other half of the class is like, this is kid stuff. Why are we doing this? And I'm like, all right, we're gonna just kind of keep going, see what happens. We had a little like 1 minute role play at the beginning and the end of each class period. After about 2 sessions and seeing the journaling entries, I was, this is going okay. We're fine. They started getting into it. For comparison, the previous semester I was using the standard class format with no role playing elements, and they had to still do these journals in between, so to help with practicing record keeping. I'd get like one sentence or like a word response for the prompts, and we're like, it needs to be like a little bit more than that. This one, when you ask, what did the engineer learn instead of what did you learn? Oh my gosh, there's this entire story. People were coming up with backstories for this character. One person was like, this character is going to be my version of Tony Stark, because they were really into Marvel. I'm like, okay, yes, like make a fictional engineer and show how Tony Stark went to college. I don't know, like, they had a lot of fun with it and it got really engaging, but they also hit every single course requirement point, and it was across the whole class, even the ones that were like, this is kid stuff. It kind of broke that barrier down, and we were able to start having more conversations about where do you actually see yourself in 10 years based on what we've talked about with this engineer, when their paper at the beginning of the semester, which is what's your passion in engineering, was basically, well, my parents said this career makes money. It's now, okay, we could actually see some kind of progression. And okay, we could do this and this and this. So it was really uncomfortable at first, just to kind of loop it back, because I didn't know how it was going to play out, and I needed to wait a couple class periods, but I was also really used to being uncomfortable in front of the class. So for me, it didn't faze me much. If you're a natural teacher and role playing and improv is kind of hard, it might be a little bit different experience. So that's kind of like the big loop on where it goes. Does that sort of answer what you're asking? Okay. Uh, right. I I hate to say this, but it is just kind of try it out. I tried it out with my kid a lot more, or like I practiced on my kid essentially. Um, I was a crash test engineer. COVID happened, and my husband is also an engineer, and so we're both trying to work like 60 hours a week remotely with a 2-year-old in the house. And so we're like, okay, we're going to put this part of the career on hold. There's no daycare options. And I'm like, what do I do here? And so I started using tabletop RPGs to teach my kids social emotional skills that were being missed from going to daycare and playing with other kids. So, it's okay, here's Sandy the Dragon was the big one. Sandy the Dragon's having a hard time sharing today. And how can Sandy the Dragon learn to share with his friend Buster, or something like that? So that was how I got a lot of my practice. And the first time I did that, I was like, I don't know what's going to happen, but we are all bored and need something to do here. And so practicing with somebody that you're familiar with or in an environment that you're more familiar with can be a really good start, because you get the basic skills of coming up with those ideas and being able to actually voice them. Because I think a lot of people get ideas, but then like actually saying them is really hard. So that can help with just breaking down that barrier of getting it from in here out to here in a like somewhat coherent kind of manner that you feel comfortable with. Yeah. So if you have a friend that you can play tabletop RPGs with and be like, hey, I would like to try this out with you first, that is a great opportunity to do so. And I cannot think of any of my friends who would not be willing to go on this like weird little chemistry quest, and they would probably be more chaotic than my child was, or like any kind of class scenario would be. Like they'd probably be like, I want to take the potions out of the door. I'm going to use every tool I have in my power to pry them from the door and mix them together to see what happens. And I know my players would do that. So that's kind of, that would help me to work out any of like the kinks in the story, to get used to talking about it, coming up with different ideas and so on. This is kind of like play testing yourself a little bit. So, yes. Hmm. Yeah. So for looking at it with the college class, it would be we would come into the class. I know that we have to do a certain level of in-class experiments or thought exercises for the day, and then they were going to have some kind of homework. So I start out with a bit of a story where um, you have been hired on to help design, because we had the egg drop experiment. This was like a really common one. So in the college class, we would do the egg drop experiment, but they have to write an engineering report for it. So it's a really simple experiment, but it's been elevated to college level reporting, and the main goal for that is to work on reporting skills. The role play would be your class engineer has been hired as an intern during their junior year of college to help with designing a packaging case for these Fabergé eggs that are being moved into an exhibit at the DIA. So I'm from Michigan, so like the Detroit Institute of Art is like what we used as our example. And you're going to be in charge of doing like the basic design and doing some testing on it. And then you need to report it to a senior engineer for evaluation. And it's still going to go through a vetting process before it's actually built and used. But your job is to do some of this initial work. And that's reasonable. It integrates it into the story of this engineer going through college, getting their first internship, getting a job, getting laid off, having to find a new job. It's this whole like story arc throughout the whole semester. But this lets them sort of have some kind of like really basic frame. And then at the end of the lesson, after they've made the package, they've tested it and whatnot, we talk about, okay, so they actually had a whole bunch of interns working on this, and these ones worked out okay. This is the final design they came up with, which integrated a element from each of these designs. And your internship ends, you do fine, and you go back to school for after the summer break is over, and you're going back into your lesson. And that sounds kind of like a bit of a trail off, but that's okay, because life is like that, and it teaches that. These are freshmen coming in. They're going to have an idea of what it's like to just kind of like have a project end and let it go. So even though it wasn't something super, super exciting at the conclusion, there is still a teachable moment in that. And that was something that I included in the journaling prompt is, what did that feel like? And so that wasn't something that was part of the core curriculum, but something I wanted to include because there's a lot of feelings associated with going through a career path that nobody really prepares you for. It's kind of like, oh yeah, go out there, do this, and the job ends, and there's like this mourning period of like, I really liked that job. Why is it gone now? Like, I want to go back to that internship, and it's just done. So, that does that kind of answer like what you're looking for? Okay, cool. Yes. Hmm. Yes. There is a talk that I'm doing tomorrow that will go into this in way more in depth. So it's pre-K to college, different age, same concept, because I have like the bookends. I have my small child, and I have college students that I have used this with, and like the in-between period, I'm kind of like picking that all up now through like I've got like a pro GM thing that I'm doing with like tweens. There's some work that I'm doing on projects for high school students and whatnot. But one thing, so what I'm going to actually like compare is the pre-K to college kids, because that seems like the larger span. It's actually not terribly different between the two. So obviously the language needs to change, but the points of struggle tend to be really similar between the two. So being able to accept the story and get engaged with it, the younger kids tend to do better with that than the college kids. Um, but there can be struggle in both areas. The college kids will be able to pick up more complicated mechanics, but that's not the focus of what we're doing. So that doesn't end up really helping them out too much. Um, it's that creativity and being able to engage with the story tends to be the biggest hiccup for older players than it does for younger ones. Um, so I don't know if, like, I don't have much difference in the mechanics between games for younger players and older players in general. So I don't have that as like a differentiating point. It's more the lead into the role play. If I tell my kid, you're going to be going on an adventure and need to talk to the swamp witch, my kid's like, yeah, I'm going to go talk to the swamp witch. Why wouldn't I talk to the swamp witch? This is cool. I'm going to go stick the pH strips in the thing and it's going to be awesome. If I tell my college students, instead of giving them the example about transporting the Fabergé eggs, which is like a real world example that does not require a giant leap in creative storytelling expansion, if I told them, okay, so you need to transport dragon eggs across the continent, which is not terribly different functionally in any way, I'm going to lose half the class usually. I need to integrate that really slowly. Some students will really get into it at first, and that's totally okay. But you are probably going to lose a few if they're not already primed with like fantasy material. So does that kind of answer?
Yeah.
Cool. I've done it with both before. There's 3 modes that I tend to use. One is solo play, one is small group play, and then one is full group play. So solo play is usually going to be if the students are able to read. Solo journaling games are really good for that because you can assign like a chapter per class period, have them write down their prompts and whatnot, and then there is a written assignment that you can turn in at the end, and those can be very self-directed. Small group play is going to be if you have like a group of or class of 20, you can divide them into 5 groups of 4. They're going to self-manage, and then you're going to go around to answer questions, make sure everyone's kind of staying on track, and it's more of a supervising kind of role. And then there is full group play, and that's usually what I would use for really young kids, where there is one character for the whole class, so that way everyone's kind of focusing on one point. They're not going to be able to self-manage small groups of 4 or really self-manage individual play in a way that aligns with the class material. And then it's going to be a large collaborative storytelling process. Maybe they're voting by raising hands, or there is they have a giant foam die that they roll when it's time to make a roll, which, like, my kid loves that. We have a big D20 and a big inflatable D6. And I've also run games at conventions where, like, each kid gets 2 dice, like 2 foam dice that are about that big. And when it's time to make a roll, I go, okay, throw them at me. And however many 5s and 6s we get, that's what we go with. And they're like, wait, throw it at you? And I'm like, yes. And then, oh, okay. And then all of a sudden, everyone wants to make rolls all the time. And they're really engaged in it. So group play is going to usually be a lot better for really young kids. You might start losing some of the older kids with that because they're going to let just the active players really kind of engage in it. With older kids, I'll usually use solo play or small individual group play, unless, like, for the engineering class, it was kind of a combination where we had a group story in the beginning and the end, but then everyone was journaling individually. So that was kind of the individual play element. So, yep.
In terms of differentiation, have you ever had any experience with differentiation? What does that look like?
When you say significant differentiation, what do you mean?
Uh, Modifying the assignment quickly,
Mm-hmm.
not just the text, the mechanics,
Mm-hmm.
things that require you to completely switch it up.
Yes.
example, a child with social emotional disability, or a child with executive function disability.
Yep.
What does that look like?
So it can, so usually if you have, so you're talking about like a mixed group of students. Okay. Um, it was a consideration when I made this game here. So this is a solo journaling game, but then I also made it applicable to being used for a whole class. And there is a section in the educator guide about accessible learning. So there's a slideshow deck that helps with visual, like some people have a hard time with the book and are going to be able to engage with the visual material more on a slide deck. There's also narrated slides. So that way you have written words and then you also have audio associated with that. You're not going to be able to always get that. So that's like maybe one example for physical differentiation. When it comes to social emotional, that one can be, so I GM for a group of tweens, and there is a higher percentage of maybe neurospicy in the group than you would find in a normal sampling of the population. And that was intentional, like, so that way, like, it was part of the purpose for the group. And there's one player who really wants to follow the plot line, and another player who is, I think, intentionally causing chaos and pulling the rest of the group with them. And so in order to differentiate what they both want, I have this twin-headed dragon. One is obsessed with order and the other is obsessed with chaos. They're the same dragon, but with two heads. So both players can follow their own paths and still arrive to meeting, like helping out the same NPC, essentially. At one point, they split the party, and that was okay. And I flipped back and forth and managed that. And it allowed the one guy who really did not like the chaos to have a quieter space for a little bit. And we could talk about that a little bit separately. He still got information that was relevant to the plot and was able to share that with the group, but did not have to handle necessarily like the interruptions and things like that, and was able to focus on what he needed and then be able to come back in and participate in the story when it was time. And then with the other group, I lovingly call them the Chaos Squad. They had a totally different way of handling it, and I let that be okay. If it was in a classroom setting, I would probably say, okay, we're having fun. We do need to finish these learning objectives. Otherwise, we can't do this again. And I would really like to do this activity with you again. Usually that's enough to kind of rein back in. With this one, I was like, I would really like to get to your backstory elements. And we are limited to 10 sessions for this event. And I can't do that if we don't get to the bad guy at the end to have the big reveal to see how he's connected to everybody. And they were like, wait, he's connected to everybody? And I was like, yep, I hate to, you got me here. You got me to spill the beans. Or they're like, oh, I want like an owlbear and a chainsaw. And I'm like, you know what? Let's see what happens at the end when the interdimensional portals activate. And they're like, interdimensional portals? And I'm like, so there's kind of ways to motivate, like, getting back into the story or like drawing in. And that's kind of what I found has been the most helpful, is a lot of what I've dealt with has been attention kind of drifting off. And so that's kind of where this is more interesting now than everything else or the chaos. And so we're going to kind of come back to it. So that can be a way to sort of like loop back into it, is this is more interesting now. We've dropped a little bit of lore. You got me. I accidentally said too much. You tricked me into it kind of thing. And that can kind of help with looping back in. Does that answer what you were sort of looking for? Okay. And I think we have hit time and actually gone a little bit over. So I will stick around for a couple minutes if they don't kick me out for the next one. If you have any questions you want to chat with me about up here. But otherwise, thank you for coming, and I hope to see you again at some of the other presentations. So.